So what I'm here to do is give you a background from a big food, Mondelez perspective, on how we view typical regulatory frameworks related to claims. And so this is a very broad overview, not just specific to Canada, not just specific to Europe, but just in terms of how we see these things around the world. And typically, what you see is identification of the food substance is something you really have to do every time. So you have to know what it is that is the basis for which you're making your claim. You have to have some kind of cause and effect relationship, and what this usually boils down to is a hypothesized mode of action for why your food substance would elicit a functional benefit. And then, of course, you have to specify or define exactly what that physiological benefit is. So in this way, we can link the food substance of interest and the benefit that's the subject of the claim. So in most cases, and we've talked about this repeatedly today, I guess, especially in the morning, health claims are related to the prevention or mitigation of diseases. Function claims are related to the normal structure and function of the body. And the type of scientific evidence that you need to provide or assess for these different types of claims, of course, depends on the food substance that you're looking at, the population that is the subject of the claim. Of course, healthy maybe for more of the function claim, at risk for disease risk reduction possibly, and of course the physiologic outcome of interest. And so you have to do the right study with the right people, looking at the right endpoint with the right ingredient. So all these things need to connect in order for us typically to have any opportunity to be comfortable, whether it's in a environment where maybe function claims are required for pre-market approval, or even in an environment where they're not required. So, we are responsible as a company for protecting the integrity of our brands, and when we put something on our label, we have to be able to back it up with the scientific evidence to make that claim. So I'd like to give an example of the application of the framework, and so this dovetails very nicely with the presentation earlier about EFSA. And in our case, we're talking about slowly digestible starch. I think by this time of day, you have slowly digestible starch fatigue. We've heard so much about slowly digestible carbs and slowly digestible starch. But you can blame Klaus Englist, who's the person who developed the assay that is commonly used nowadays to measure starch digestibility. And this assay is very widely used, and it's probably the assay with the most connection or relationships between the food component and the physiologic effect. So if you look across the scientific literature, it becomes fairly clear. So what we have with slowly digestible starch is we have a conditions of use, and Christine introduced it actually very nicely. We have to have at least 55% of the available carbohydrates as starch, of which 40% or more has to be slowly digestible. So it's a percent of a percent, and that's a very important factor because if you think about what those available carbohydrates are, we have sugars, we have starches. You have to have enough starch so that that proportion of slowly digestible starch is meaningful physiologically. And the studies that were submitted and that are the subject of the claim demonstrate that effect, as Christine showed. So we do, of course, have a hypothesized mode of action, and that is the decreased rate of exogenous glucose appearance into the blood. And we even have isotope tracer studies to back this up. So it's not just about what we're seeing in the in vitro assay, but it's also what we're seeing physiologically with C13 labeled types of research. And then finally, decreased postprandial glycemic response without exacerbated insulinemic response. This gets back to the actual mechanism of action of if you have a slower rate of appearance into the body, you have a decreased, essentially, excursion in metabolism. And you have to think about glucose kinetics. So glucose kinetics play a role in how we think about this framework. So this is an oversimplified view of glucose kinetics. And I know there's people in this room that could add a lot more arrows and a lot more regulatory pieces to this. But if we think about just a very simplified view of glucose kinetics, you have a carb load that comes into the intestine. You have a rate of appearance. You have a glucose concentration in the blood. And that's homeostatically regulated by the liver. You have insulin and glucagon that play back and forth. And then, of course, you have rate of disposal into the peripheral tissue. And I think this is something that a lot of times when we think about glycemic response and talk about these different areas, we kind of neglect to go back to think about how are blood sugar concentrations regulated. And the reality is different food components could affect glucose appearance, like slowly digestible carbohydrates, like starches and the sugar, I guess, that Christine talked about, viscous fibers, fats or other modifiers of gastric emptying, and changes to the available carb content. If you shrink down the amount of available carbs that are consumed in a serving of food, of course, you'll have less glucose coming in, although the rate may or may not change. But then you can think about on the other side of the equation, food components that could affect glucose disposal, protein, amino acids, carbohydrate preloads can do this. Consumption of resistant starch over time, we can look at the second meal effect. So those are some very interesting things that are emerging in the literature. And these things that are increasing the rate of disposal might increase insulin concentration, insulin sensitivity, or both through a variety of different mechanisms. So I think it's important to consider this when we're thinking about mechanisms and we're thinking about connecting a food substance to an actual functional benefit. So what are the implications of this? We actually use glycemic index quite a bit. In fact, Tom alluded to a client that did a ring study. That was Mondelez that did the ring study with glycemic index using the new ISO standard, because we, of course, do a lot of testing whenever we're thinking about making this type of claim. So we're going to do testing, not necessarily additional randomized control trials, but we have to make sure that as we're producing product, we have consistent results between things we're manufacturing and things that were tested in those original studies. So glycemic index in this context can be a very useful tool when discriminating among foods with known compositional differences, like changes in proportions of slowly digestible to rapidly digestible starch. And of course, a corollary to that is that with glycemic index, things become a little complicated for us in some ways, in that a similar change in the incremental area, which is just the trapezoids drawn under that curve, can be the result of different underlying glucose kinetics. So different food components, different modes of action, and potentially different health implications. We don't know. I think, as was discussed earlier, it's not that it's not a good thing to use maybe amino acids to lower the glycemic response by increasing disposal, but it's just a question. I'm not sure that the literature that we have on GI and GL discriminates between these different mechanisms of action. So the bottom line for us really is when we think about making this type of claim as a big company, we have to think about the substance, how that mechanism works, how that mode of action works, what the cause and effect relationship is, and then what the physiologic benefit is. So that's basically the Mondelez perspective. So happy to take any questions.
More than a question, is a comment. Of course, I was following very closely from the EFSA part, the scientific evaluation of that claim. And I wanted to say that actually the claim being authorized was quite different from the claim that was for which the request was made in the first place. And it took quite some time and clock stop letters and communication, very intense communication with the applicant actually, not only for the evaluation or to identify what was missing, but also to understand how to frame and formulate the claim. It was not easy, not evident to everybody from the first time. So I think it's a very good and important example of how the conversation with the evaluation authorities can just lead to something that it makes some scientific sense, I don't know, probably you want to add something to that. But
yeah,
I thought it was a very good...
Thank you. What I could add, I think, is that I think we learned a lot, actually, from that process. And it's something that we've learned and applied in other regions as well. So I think the EFSA process really is one that maybe sets a global standard for evaluation of that kind of claim. And so I think it can be very difficult from a manufacturer perspective, but at the same time, if the evidence is there and there really is something that you can communicate, I think it's a very positive thing. So, yeah.
I appreciate that industry is interested in evaluating possible mechanisms related to the postprandial glucose rise. But I think that the blood glucose elevation in the postprandial period is per se a relevant physiological function as EFSA is defining it. Because you can see that if you look at the drugs affecting blood glucose levels with different mechanisms, they are all beneficial, at least in reducing the glucose toxicity, which is an important loop which is going to perpetuate the derangement metabolic situation. And even studies looking, for instance, in relation to prevention of diabetes, if you utilize metformin or you utilize pioglitazone, they have shown both to be effective in reducing the risk of diabetes, despite the fact that they work on different mechanisms, one more on the liver side, one more on peripheral insulin sensitivity. So I think that if you are able to reduce postprandial glucose rise, whatever the mechanism that you have been utilizing, that's in any case a beneficial physiological function.
Yeah, thank you for that comment as well. And we view this, I mean, we view that endpoint per se as a beneficial physiologic effect, and it's good that I think we're seeing increased recognition from regulatory authorities about that as well. And I think really what my point is about the connection of the food component with the physiologic benefit. And really, you know, is it really a cause and effect, or is there something else going on that maybe you haven't defined the food substance and there's something that can't be explained? So yeah, thank you for that.